Uh, the every time we come onto a Zoom meeting, it is at least in some measure a reminder of something that we've lost. And yet, as Matt's video reminded us, we've also gained something. We've learned some things. And what I want to do in my message this morning is just to help us reflect on the learning from this season that we might bring into the expression of serving God through the local church. So I'm going to share a PowerPoint screen. You can still have me visible if you prefer to see me speaking. You can change your settings on the view settings there on Zoom, but otherwise the PowerPoint will be on the screen. So the question then, what have we learned? And there are three questions that I would like us to consider this morning, and we're going to really race through these, but very happy to pick some of them up in the question and answer a little later on. Number one, what have we learned about the world that we're living in? Secondly, how has God used the pandemic to cleanse and renew us, not simply individually, but perhaps as local church, as churches? What has God been teaching us? How has he cleansed and how does he want to renew us through this season? And then the third question, what is the way ahead for the church? And I think the underlying presumption in my talk, and it may be assumption, if you like, is that I want to challenge the thought that we want to just go back to the way things were. I know that here in England, they're talking about after the 19th of July, and the Welsh government will be looking at other dates for removing most of the restrictions or opening up to a greater degree of freedom. But does that presuppose that we want to go back to the way things were? Surely there must be a great degree of learning that we're going to take forward with us. So what have we learned about the world that we live in? Well, first of all, isn't it interesting that we discovered that the world closed in an instant? The world closed in an instant. Even if you were alive for the last global pandemic, and looking at the screen, I think that's unlikely. It came straight after the First World War. None of us have experienced anything quite like this. Because, of course, this has been magnified by wall-to-wall 24-hour news coverage and social media. And that has only magnified and multiplied the fear and the panic that we saw in so many people's hearts and lives and across so many nations, particularly at the beginning of the crisis. I want to read some verses from Psalm 9. I'm not going to put them on the screen, but just simply from the NIV, the psalmist talks about the nations. And in Psalm 9, he says in verse 5, speaking to God, "You have rebuked the nations." Verse 15, "The nations have fallen into the pit that they have dug." Verse 17, "The wicked go down to the realm of the dead, all the nations that forget God. Let the nations," in verse 19 and 20, "let the nations be judged in your presence. Strike them with terror, Lord. Let the nations know they are only mortal." I think it's really worth our while reflecting on the contrast between the nations of this world, which are temporary and transitory. They come and they go, they rise and they fall, and we contrast that with the kingdom of our God, which lasts forever. In fact, the writer to the Hebrews says, and I think it's a very appropriate scripture for us today, he talks about God shaking the things which can be shaken, so that that which remains is unshakable. And of course, the unshakable thing is the kingdom of God. In fact, I think David Gooding, when he wrote his commentary on the book of Hebrews, called it an unshakable kingdom. And I think that's just a great thought for us to reflect on in this season. So here, as we hope to move forward beyond COVID or living with COVID, out of lockdowns towards greater freedoms, several key thoughts strike me that we should reflect on. Number one is this. The pandemic or the virus has operated as something of a truth serum. Or maybe I can use a different expression, a wake-up call. Sorry, I live in a household of girls where they're very into their Marvel movies and their Marvel comic heroes. And truth serum, if you know that kind of story, is something that once you're injected with it, it's like you wake up and you see the world as it really is. And I think that there are a number of ways in which this season has functioned to wake people up in our world, both Christians and unbelievers. And I want to share 4 observations as we reflect on the world. Number 1, the fear of death really has gripped people's hearts. There was no illusion, no fantasy. The reality of death and the fragility of life came home to so many. Ecclesiastes, the writer says, God has set eternity in the hearts of men. And, you know, most of the way in which people live is to wrap a blanket of comfort around themselves so they do not have to think about reality. On Thursday, I took the funeral of a lovely Christian lady up in Kidderminster, and there were many unbelievers there, and I had a wonderful opportunity to share both in the church and at the graveside about the reality of death and the opportunity through Christ of eternity. And, you know, many people have been faced with that reality in this season and perhaps have thought about it in a way that they have not done nationally and globally before in our lifetimes. Secondly, the gods of this age proved to be both fragile but also stubborn. I mean, could you believe that on the announcement of a first minister or a prime minister or a president that entertainment closed, shopping closed, business closed, offices closed, theaters closed, sports stadiums closed, everything closed? And the gods of this age, the gods of consumerism and entertainment, were closed in an instant. But of course, people only had to get the sniff of the Nike shop or Primark reopening, and the queues were around the block. Nothing wrong with shopping, but that's one of the comfort blankets, isn't it? The consumerist lifestyle, the entertainment culture in which we live, those are some of the gods of the age. They crashed in an instant, but they are stubborn. And we need to reflect and remember that as we move forward. Think about the prophets of Baal that Elijah confronted, and the people discovered that those gods were fragile. They weren't real at all. But it didn't take more than a few minutes for Elijah still to flee from Jezebel. I believe in this season we have seen a new thirst for the gospel. Quite remarkable. 2 surveys done online, one by Tear Fund, one by another group last year, one at the beginning of the pandemic, one later on, both in the United Kingdom, showed that around 25% of the United Kingdom population accessed online Christian services in the first few months of lockdown. That's remarkable when you take into account that on average, certainly here in England, about 3 or 4% of people regularly attend church, and that regular attendance is measured as at least once a month. But almost 25% of people over a period of months were accessing Christian and other religious material online. But there was a thirst for reality, which reminds us, of course, of that fear of death gripping people's hearts. The gods of the age were collapsing, were proving to be fragile. And that thirst was something that we saw in many ways. Before I just touch on that last point, a couple of illustrations. One county's evangelist, David Brown in the West Midlands, a neighbour died and he couldn't get to the funeral. And they had an on-the-street memorial service for the lady, and all 40 people who lived on that street in the first lockdown stood on the street as David Brown led a little service on the 23rd Psalm that coincided with the moment of the funeral service, which could only be attended by 6 people. And David said not many of those 40 would not have attended the funeral service, but something in the woman's death under the circumstances brought them onto the street and allowed him to share the gospel. Another evangelist that many of you will know, Jonathan Brain, set gazebos up on his street. And again, the whole cul-de-sac, the whole close attended on-street services. People attending online alpha courses in Christianity Explored. In our own church here in Melcham, our second online alpha course during the last year was attended by 16 people, of which 10 we had never met and connected with us first and foremost through the online service that we were running Sunday by Sunday. That's remarkable. There's a thirst for the gospel, which reminds us that our God is sovereign. Right at the heart of Psalm 9 is this verse 11, and I didn't read it earlier. Sing the praises of the Lord enthroned in Zion, proclaim among the nations what he has done. And that reminds us, of course, of the Great Commission. Jesus says, go into all the world, preaching the gospel and making disciples. But if it has been a wake-up call, a truth serum, it's also been an inoculation for others. You know, the gods of the age are fragile, but they are stubborn. The world will seek to counter those 4 observations that I've reflected on. It will seek to ease the fear of death and spiritual reality through rebuilding the gods of this age. It's interesting, in 1 Samuel 5, we read this. After the Philistines captured the Ark of God, they took it from the battleground at Ebenezer to the town of Ashdod. They carried the Ark of God to the temple of Dagon and placed it beside an idol of Dagon. But when the citizens of Ashdod went to see it in the next morning, Dagon had fallen with his face to the ground in front of the Ark of the Lord. So they took Dagon and put him in his place again. But the next morning, the same thing happened. He had fallen face before the Lord, before the Ark of the Lord again. This time his head and hands had broken off and were lying in the doorway. Only the trunk of his body was left intact. You better believe it, the world will do everything they can to put the sticking plaster back on the gods of this age. And whatever that might be that would distract people from reflecting on the reality of life and the reality of eternity and the opportunity of the gospel, Satan will do all he can to confront and counter this opportunity. New broken wells will also be dug. It's not just about rebuilding the old ways of the past, but new broken wells will be dug. It was interesting. I think an interesting parallel was the collapse of the Iron Curtain when the Berlin Wall came down, and many Christian agencies, including the Billy Graham Association, had remarkable freedom to go across into Eastern Europe. David Gooding and John Lennox amongst those who found great opportunities in the universities. But within the first year or two, as the gospel flooded into the vacuum, with it also came all of the other new opportunities, whether it was materialism or other cults and cultures from the West, and new wells, broken wells, were dug. And I think as people search for spiritual reality, there will be a enthusiasm, a new enthusiasm for all kinds of Eastern philosophies, meditation, and all kinds of alternative spiritualities. And I think we'll see an increase in that as a reaction to this age. And if God is truly sovereign, and we believe he is, the world will do all it can to re-emphasize human sovereignty. It was interesting, just pick these up through the period of the last year. Science will save us from COVID-19, but first we have to save ourselves. Or how science will save the world. In fact, I remember Boris Johnson standing at one of his press conferences as the first vaccinations were being rolled out, saying science has come to save us. Now, we shouldn't just brush that off as a simple little statement. In fact, it's interesting. It's actually a faith in scientists, not necessarily science. There are all kinds of sciences that counter one another. But the world will seek to reestablish its own sovereignty because there was a real sense of losing control. We want to reinstigate control, and we will see human beings seek to reinstigate control. Secondly, and I'm very conscious of time, how has God used the pandemic to cleanse and renew us as church? One of my favorite characters in the whole of Scripture is Nehemiah. And of course, we know that he came to rebuild broken walls. There had been a season of brokenness, a season of a long period of exile, and then there was a slow rebuilding. But under Nehemiah, the walls were rebuilt and lives were restored to worship God. But it's really interesting that it's Nehemiah chapter 1 which holds the key. As he hears the news of the brokenness in his world, and particularly in Jerusalem, God breaks his heart. His heart is broken. He weeps, he prays, and he fasts. And I think it's worth us reflecting and asking the question, has God broken me? Has God broken us? Perhaps in our models of church, in our methodology. It may be that there have been things that were fractured, and God has used this season to allow those things to be broken, because we need to clear the rubble and start building with new material. So what's the way ahead for the church in this context? Well, I think two things. Number one, a return to simple church. And I know most of us here are from Brethren Assemblies, Gospel Hall background people, as I am, of course, myself. And this should excite us. I think there's an opportunity here that should excite us about discovering what the reality is of the church and the New Testament and how that looks in the world in which we currently live. Simple church. What does that look like? Francis Chan, in his book, which was produced in 2018, Letters to the Church, it's a book worth reading. In fact, you could almost say it was a prophetic book. It was a book of its time because it was written before the global pandemic, and yet I think there's much there for us to learn. And in this this season, perhaps this is for us the end of performance-based church services. Many of us, myself included, have wanted to, and there's no bad thing in wanting the quality of what we produce to be better, because we're serving God, and of course he deserves our best. But sometimes because we increase the quality of presentation, the quality of music, the slickness, if you like, we drift towards a performance-based kind of church. And perhaps this is a moment for us to realize that performance-based church is not growing disciples, and it lacks simplicity. Many churches, perhaps many that we are engaged in ourselves, sit, I'm using the word provocatively, cinema style, but you know what I mean, theater style, being fed from the front. The most biblical or culturally relevant form for our main church services is this fed from the front. But is that the most biblical? Is that the most culturally relevant way for us to learn in this season? Does that reflect both scripture and context? And I would suggest perhaps it doesn't. It's a measure of spirituality defined by our church attendance. So I wrote a piece that was written up in Premiere Online a week or two ago, and had the privilege of doing an interview for UCB Radio on the question, has Zoom created pajama Christians? And I know many of us have a fear of that many Christians will take it easy, they'll put their feet up, they'll grab a cup of coffee, and they'll watch church. They'll not engage in growing as disciples. But Darren Taylor Roberts, who is a county's trustee, Darren has written a chapter for a book which we're producing in counties, God willing, later this year on evangelism in a post-COVID world. And Darren says we need to think of the online opportunity as a place where people can lean in rather than fear it as a place where people are leaning out. And if people do drift out, it may simply be that the pandemic has hastened a drifting away that was already there in their hearts. But my experience and the word that I'm receiving from many evangelists and church leaders is that online, as the video that we've just watched has demonstrated, is creating a deeper opportunity for some to engage than they may have had otherwise. So let's be cautious about attendance at meetings being the measure of spirituality. Might want to reflect on that. And our disciples best grown through program-based ministry. Program-based, what do I mean by that? We've used the Alpha Course, Christianity Explored, and other programs. I'm a believer in programs, but sometimes we're so committed to a program that we forget about the people, and we invite people to attend our program, our event, our weekly Wednesday lunch club, our Thursday night youth program. And they don't attend, and we say, well, people just aren't interested. We hold up our hands, say, well, people aren't interested anymore. Maybe this is a moment for us to reflect whether the problem has been our program rather than the people. What does people-focused ministry and discipleship making actually look like? The Church of England have said that they may be paying off 20% of their ministers in the coming season. So simple church, less perhaps is actually more in church life, and the future of the church may become smaller but more agile. Perhaps even small is church. So many of us in larger fellowships, we have small groups or life groups, but maybe those life groups and small groups could take on a greater recognition of existing as a representation of church life in its completeness, with the opportunity to meet together for larger events from time to time. Of course, when Paul wrote to the church in Rome, Romans 16, greet this household, greet that household, greet those who meet in such and such a home. And it seems to me that the church of Christ in Rome was made up of lots of groups meeting in lots of homes. And maybe we've not really been good enough at pursuing that as a New Testament and culturally relevant approach. We need to increase the R rate. The R rate of the pandemic, we want to get that below 1 so the pandemic dies away and comes to an end. But the reproduction rate in the church in the United Kingdom, in the West, in Europe, has been shocking. Is it possible that if we could reproduce one disciple each in our lifetimes or more, that the church would actually begin to grow again? We need to train ourselves in how to share the gospel, share our testimony, and tell others how to find Christ. Fewer programs, deeper relationships. Perhaps that is the way forward. An article online, just one of many, why churches must grasp the opportunity to redefine discipleship. And I've mentioned life groups. Often life groups in our churches are simply, or house groups, if you like, are simply safe spaces for believers. But what if they were a safe space for everyone, for unbelievers to come and investigate, to explore, to learn to worship, to learn to come to faith in Jesus Christ? One way that we have been pursuing that is by redefining our mission in our local church, by looking at the Great Commission as gather, grow, go. Actually, it really begins with go, doesn't it? Go, gather, grow. But it's a cycle. We come back and we learn and we go again. We gather, we grow, we go, we gather, and we grow. And then finally, I talked about a move towards blended church, a move towards blended or hybrid. I think Matt's calling it hybrid church. Blended church or hybrid church, you know, a broadcast Sunday service. It was interesting. I had the opportunity of interviewing Nicky Gumbel of the Alpha Course recently, and he said that they had not wanted at Holy Trinity Brompton Church in London. They hadn't wanted to do a live streamed church service for good reasons. They didn't want people to sit at home from other churches, not attend their own church, and just sit and watch their church service. But then, just as we saw in the video, when they had to do a streamed service or a pre-recorded service during lockdown, a young woman wrote to him and said, since I was 18, I was diagnosed with an illness that meant that my immune system is compromised and I cannot leave home. And now that I can watch and join in every Sunday, I feel like I belong to the church, which has always been my home. But for the first time, I feel like I actually belong. But Darren writes, a broadcast service is just the start. It's naturally an evangelistic tool, she writes, that enables people to check out their local church while remaining somewhat anonymous, like Zacchaeus in the tree. However, live streaming your service while giving valuable insight into your church and providing a platform for the gospel to be heard is simply putting your physical church service online. It's a one-sided conversation. It's only the beginning, the start of blended church. But we must ask questions. How do we draw people in to a relationship with Christ and a discipling relationship with others? And Darren suggests that if you're going to make appointments, you need to make appointments to this area. What about investing in digital output? Tim Cracknell, County's worker up in the Forest of Dean, they have raised some money locally, and they have spent it on being able to broadcast their service in a better way in the coming years. And they have appointed actually a Darren, who is a trustee who I've mentioned from counties. Darren is going to be working with them in finding pathways, stepping stones from the digital world to the real world, and how we can find the ways forward to bring people into the life of the church. Well, we've got a lot of challenges ahead, haven't we? But the Lord himself goes before you. He will be with you. He will never leave you nor forsake you. Do not be afraid. Do not be discouraged. May God bless you as we consider these things and discuss them later on. Thank you, Glenn.
Well, thank you, Martin. Thank you very much for those thoughts, very thought-provoking.